They thought burning down my house would make me join their little HOA club. What they didn't know is that I literally wrote the municipal fire codes they just violated. I'm Jerome, and I'm standing in what used to be my kitchen, holding the legal binder that sent my HOA president to federal prison for 8 years. 6 months ago, this was my family's dream home where my kids fed chickens every morning. Today, it's a pile of ash and the smoking gun that exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud conspiracy mixed with something even uglier, racial hatred disguised as community standards. The acrid smell of wet charcoal clings to my clothes like a ghost of the life they tried to steal. I'm drinking coffee from a thermos because, well, hard to brew anything when your kitchen is a crater. But here's what Rebecca Sterling didn't count on. When you try to burn down a black code enforcer's house while calling it neighborhood improvement, you better not leave evidence behind. Spoiler alert, she left everything. FBI raids, handcuffs, federal hate crime charges, the whole justice buffet. What would you do if your neighbors literally tried to burn you out while making it clear your skin color was part of the problem? Drop it in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how global this HOA nightmare really is. My name is Jerome Washington, and for 25 years I've been the guy who shows up when your neighbor builds a deck without permits or runs a meth lab in their garage. Municipal Code Enforcement Officer. Basically, I'm the rulebook police. My wife Keisha is a high school principal, and we have teenage twins, Malik and Zara, who think I'm the most boring dad on the planet. Until this story, they were probably right. Our house sat on 2 acres of what used to be farmland, inherited from my grandfather, a man who'd farmed this land since the 1940s when most black families couldn't even dream of owning property like this. Grandpa Moses had bought it with cash earned from working 3 jobs and a stubborn belief that his grandchildren would need roots. The property was grandfathered in when the subdivision sprouted around us like expensive mushrooms after rain. While our neighbors got quarter-acre lots and HOA covenants, we kept our wraparound porch, vegetable garden, workshop, and yes, a small flock of chickens that provided fresh eggs and endless entertainment for the kids. Every morning, I'd sit on that porch with my coffee, listening to roosters crow and watching Keisha tend her herb garden. The smell of basil and oregano mixed with the earthy scent of turned soil. Malik and Zara would scatter feed before school, their laughter echoing off the workshop walls, where I restored old furniture on weekends. It was peaceful. It was ours. And apparently it was driving someone absolutely insane. Enter Rebecca Sterling. Picture every entitled suburban mom stereotype, then add a real estate license, and what I'd soon learn was a deep-seated belief that neighborhoods should look a certain way with certain kinds of people. Perfectly styled auburn hair that cost more than most people's car payments, white Range Rover that never had a speck of dirt, and designer athleisure that screamed, "I have strong opinions about property values." She'd moved from Connecticut 6 months earlier, expecting her investment to be protected by what she called community standards. Our property, with its chickens and vegetable rows and workshop clutter, wasn't exactly matching the pristine white suburban vision she'd paid premium prices to join. But I'd soon discover the chickens weren't really the problem. The problem was that a successful black family was living comfortably on prime real estate that didn't fit her mental picture of how the neighborhood hierarchy should work. Her first visit came with store-bought cookies and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, even though we'd lived there 15 years longer than she had. "I brought an HOA application, just a formality to get you connected with our wonderful community." I thanked her for the cookies and politely explained that our property predated the HOA by 3 decades. We weren't required to join, and frankly, we liked our independence. Her smile flickered like a dying light bulb, and something shifted in her eyes when she realized I wasn't going to be an easy target. "Well," she said, her voice taking on a different tone, "I'm sure we can find ways to help you fit in better with the neighborhood aesthetic." Week 3 brought a certified letter about community standards and property value protection. The language was coded but clear if you knew how to read it. Week 6 escalated to anonymous complaints filed with the city about our agricultural activities in a residential zone. That's when things got interesting, and when I started to understand this wasn't just about ordinances. See, when you've spent 25 years memorizing municipal codes, you tend to know them pretty well. More importantly, when you're a black professional who's had to be twice as good to get half the recognition, You learn to document everything and know your rights inside and out. I pulled out my copy, the same thick binder that would eventually help convict her, and highlighted Section 12.3.7, agricultural grandfather clauses for properties predating residential zoning. Our chickens were legal. Our garden was legal. Our workshop was legal. Everything was legal because I'd literally helped write the ordinances that protected properties exactly like ours. But Rebecca wasn't the type to let legal technicalities stop her. And she definitely wasn't going to let a black man with a law book tell her what she could and couldn't do in her neighborhood. The complaints kept coming, but now I noticed a pattern that made my blood run cold. 17 separate violations reported in 1 week. Illegal chickens, unpermitted structures, commercial vegetable operations, noise disturbances. But buried in the formal language were phrases that made it clear this wasn't just about property maintenance. References to incompatible residents and maintaining community character and preserving neighborhood safety. I'd arrived at work to find stacks of paperwork, all bearing Rebecca's precise handwriting and our address, plus something new, complaints that mentioned our late-night gatherings and loud urban music, both complete fabrications that I recognized as racial dog whistles. My supervisor, a longtime friend, pulled me aside. "Jerome, what the hell is going on with your neighbor? And why is she asking about your family's background and whether you're really from here?" That evening, I discovered something that changed everything. While reviewing the complaint forms, I noticed Rebecca had listed our property as a commercial farm operation run by transient workers. Not only was this completely false, but filing false municipal reports is a Class C misdemeanor with a $500 fine per incident. More troubling, several complaints mentioned our questionable visitors and suggested we might be running unlicensed business activities. The implication was clear. She was painting a picture of suspicious black people engaged in illegal activities. Here's your first knowledge nugget. False reporting of code violations is a crime in most states, but when those false reports contain racial implications, federal civil rights violations come into play. Always read complaint forms carefully. One lie can turn harassment into criminal charges, but racial targeting can turn local crimes into federal cases. Keisha found me at the kitchen table that night, surrounded by paperwork and code books. "What are you thinking?" she asked, setting down fresh coffee that smelled like salvation. "I'm thinking," I said, "that our new neighbor just made her first big mistake. And I'm thinking she picked the wrong black man to mess with. But I'm also thinking this is about more than chickens, baby. This is about her believing we don't belong here." Rebecca's next move was what I call the compliance blitz with a racial twist, a strategy I'd seen bullies use before, but never this systematically combined with coded discrimination. If one complaint didn't work, maybe 17 would do the trick. Monday, illegal chicken coop violating setback requirements, plus a note about agriculture not typical for this demographic. Tuesday, unpermitted workshop edition, creating fire hazards with references to suspicious late-night construction sounds. We'd been asleep. Wednesday, commercial vegetable operation without business license, plus speculation about possible drug cultivation. By Friday, my desk looked like a paper avalanche had buried it alive, and every single complaint contained subtle or not so subtle references to our race, our supposed urban lifestyle, or questions about whether we could really afford to maintain property in this neighborhood. But here's the thing about being a black code enforcement officer for 25 years. You develop a nose for racism that could smell lies and prejudice through concrete. You also learn to document everything because you know nobody will believe you without ironclad proof. Every single complaint used identical phrasing, submitted at exactly 8:47 a.m., and contained details only visible from our property line, plus racial assumptions that revealed more about Rebecca than about us. Someone was making this their full-time job, and that someone had serious issues with successful black homeowners. The kicker, Rebecca had started scheduling wellness walks past our house with other HOA wives, all white women who'd moved from other states. Picture 5 women in matching athleisure, clutching phones like weapons, whispering behind manicured hands while photographing our chicken coop like it was evidence of war crimes. I could hear fragments of their conversations, property values, those people, this kind of neighborhood, what are they really doing over there? The constant click of phone cameras became the soundtrack to our mornings, mixing with the confused clucking of chickens who'd suddenly become the subjects of what felt like a surveillance operation with racial undertones. "This is getting ridiculous," Keisha said, watching the parade from our kitchen window. "And it's getting racial. Did you hear what Mrs. Patterson told me yesterday?" Rebecca asked her if we were really from here originally, like our family hadn't been farming this land since before she was born. She wasn't wrong to worry, but I was about to turn the tables. I decided to dig deeper into these complaints, and that's when I found Rebecca's first major mistake. On 3 separate violation reports, she'd listed our property as a commercial farm operation run by transient workers, not a residential property with grandfathered agricultural rights. She'd also made specific references to urban agricultural practices not suitable for suburban communities, and questioned whether we had legitimate income sources to maintain the property. Now, I'd seen this trick before in my career, but never with such obvious racial coding. Desperate complainants would exaggerate property descriptions, hoping to trigger different enforcement protocols. What they didn't realize is that falsely categorizing property types on official municipal reports is filing false instruments, a misdemeanor with fines up to $500 per incident. But when those false reports contain racially motivated language designed to trigger additional scrutiny based on stereotypes, that's a potential federal civil rights violation. I'd personally prosecuted 3 cases like this, and the defendants always looked shocked when the handcuffs came out. They looked even more shocked when the FBI got involved. Time for my first counterpunch. I filed a formal complaint against Rebecca with the city attorney's office, documenting every false statement and requesting investigation into harassment patterns. More importantly, I sent copies to the State Civil Rights Commission and flagged the racial language for federal attention. Then I sat back and waited for the show. The city sent their newest inspector, a young Hispanic woman fresh out of college who'd probably seen her share of discrimination and knew what to look for. I met her at the property line with my code book, original 1963 building permits, the surveyor's map from 1940 that showed our lot boundaries, and a timeline showing the escalating racial undertones in Rebecca's complaints. "Let's start with the chickens," I said, flipping to the relevant section. Municipal Ordinance 12.3.7 specifically protects agricultural uses predating residential zoning. Our coup was built in 1963. The residential zoning wasn't enacted until 1987. And here's the documentation showing my grandfather purchased this property legally in 1944, making us one of the longest established families in this entire area. The inspector's clipboard practically sagged under the weight of Rebecca's complaints, but her expression hardened as she read the racial implications. We walked the property methodically, chickens legal, workshop permitted and inspected, vegetable garden clearly personal use scale, and everything maintained to standards that would make any code enforcer proud. Every single violation got marked unfounded, with detailed notes about harassment patterns and potential discriminatory targeting. 24 hours later, the city posted a "No Violations Found" notice on our front gate, a bright yellow beacon visible from Rebecca's living room window, along with a secondary notice that the complainant was under investigation for filing false reports. That's when I witnessed my first Rebecca meltdown, and when her true colors really showed. I was checking the mail when she stormed across the street, her yoga pants practically smoking from the speed of her approach. "This is ridiculous," she shouted loud enough for 3 neighbors to peek out their windows. "That inspector obviously doesn't know what she's doing. Probably got her job through some diversity program anyway." "Ma'am," the inspector called out from her truck, her voice carrying a steel edge, "this gentleman knows municipal code better than most lawyers. Everything on this property is completely legal and has been for decades. Your complaints, however, contain language that we're required to report to civil rights authorities." Rebecca's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color I'd never seen in nature. "This isn't over, Jerome," she hissed, making my name sound like a curse word. "There's more than one way to solve a neighborhood problem. Some people just don't belong in certain places." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, and I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't about chickens anymore. This was about a white woman who believed she had the right to determine where black families could live comfortably. That evening, Keisha noticed something that made my investigator instinct start twitching. "Have you seen how many people are walking past our house lately?" she asked, pulling the curtains closed. "That's the 5th car this hour that slowed down at our driveway. And did you hear what happened to the Johnsons?" The Johnsons were the only other black family in our immediate area, And they'd started receiving anonymous flyers about maintaining property standards and preserving community values. She was right. Our quiet, dead-end street suddenly had more foot traffic than a shopping mall. Strangers with phones, unfamiliar cars cruising past, curtains twitching across the street like nervous eyelids. But what really caught my attention were the conversations I was starting to overhear. Neighbors I'd known for years were suddenly asking questions about our background and whether we were really from this area originally. The racial subtext was becoming impossible to ignore. But the real game changer came when I decided to research our HOA president's background. What I found made my blood run cold and confirmed my worst suspicions about what we were really dealing with. Rebecca Sterling held real estate licenses in 3 states, Connecticut, Arizona, and now Texas. More interesting, a pattern emerged in her previous neighborhoods, and the pattern had an ugly racial component. Holdout properties owned by minority families had developed mysterious problems. A house fire in Phoenix, Puerto Rican family. A accidental flood in Tucson, Black family. 3 property condemnations in Stamford. All minority-owned homes in gentrifying neighborhoods. All eventually sold to developers at below-market prices. All purchased by shell companies with one common thread: Rebecca Sterling as the listing agent, specializing in neighborhood transition management. "Keisha," I said that night, spreading property records across our kitchen table like a detective building a murder case, "I don't think we're dealing with a pushy neighbor anymore. I think we're dealing with a professional, and I think race has been part of her business model all along." The documents painted a clear picture. Rebecca wasn't just moving to neighborhoods randomly. She was targeting diverse communities with valuable properties and systematically driving out minority homeowners through harassment campaigns disguised as property standards enforcement. If Rebecca was a professional, she was about to show me her playbook, and honestly, it was more sophisticated than I'd given her credit for, with racial elements that were both subtle and devastating. Her next strategy was what crisis management experts call social isolation, but with a specific focus on racial othering. Turn the community against the target by making them seem foreign, dangerous, or not one of us until they have no choice but to surrender. Within 48 hours of my complaint being filed, she'd organized something called the Neighborhood Safety and Standards Committee, with official-sounding letterhead and everything. The flyers started appearing on windshields Tuesday morning. "Concerned about unregulated agricultural chemicals near our children? Join us in protecting Willowbrook families from incompatible land uses and questionable activities," complete with stock photos of smiling white children and a list of health concerns that would make you think our chicken coop was Chernobyl. But the real poison was in the coded language about maintaining community character and preserving property values, phrases any minority homeowner would recognize as dog whistles. But social media, that's where Rebecca really showed her expertise in modern racism. The Concerned Parents of Willowbrook Facebook group gained 87 members overnight. Posts appeared hourly, each one carefully crafted to avoid overtly racist language, while building a narrative about our family that relied on every negative stereotype about Black urban culture. Photos of our cluttered workshop labeled as potential drug activity. Close-ups of our compost pile described as unsanitary conditions typical of certain backgrounds. And my personal favorite, a picture of our rain barrel captioned, "Standing water breeding mosquitoes and disease. Is this what we moved here to escape?" The comments section was where the real ugliness came out. Neighbors who'd never spoken to us speculating about our real income sources, whether we were actually qualified for our jobs, and sharing concerns about urban culture spreading to their safe neighborhood. The racial coding was sophisticated but unmistakable to anyone who'd lived while Black in America. Keisha discovered the group when other teachers started asking her awkward questions. "Is it true your husband runs some kind of unlicensed farm operation?" her colleague whispered during lunch duty. "I saw the photos online. Someone said your family might not be, well, the right fit for that neighborhood." The social pressure campaign extended to our kids, and this is where I saw the real damage that racism, disguised as community standards, could do. Malik came home from school quiet, picking at his dinner. "What's wrong, son?" Keisha asked. "Nobody wanted to sit with me at lunch today," Malik mumbled. Sarah's mom told her our house might be making people sick and that maybe we should move somewhere more appropriate for our family. Zara, normally our social butterfly, mentioned that her friend Tyler couldn't come over anymore. His parents said something about unsafe environment and liability issues, but Tyler said his dad used a word I'm not supposed to repeat, something about not wanting his son around those people. The confusion and hurt in her voice was heartbreaking. This was their first real experience with racism affecting their daily lives, and I felt like I'd failed to protect them from something I'd hoped they'd never have to face. The sound of silence at our previously friendly bus stop was deafening. Empty seats around our kids at lunch, parent conversations that stopped when Keisha walked into school events. The smell of isolation was stronger than any barnyard odor Rebecca claimed to be worried about. But I'd been dealing with racism for 40 years and fighting harassment campaigns for 2 decades, and I knew something Rebecca didn't. Racists always get sloppy when they think they're winning. Time for counterpunch number 2. I spent my lunch breaks researching Rebecca's own properties through municipal databases, a skill I'd developed after years of tracking down slumlords and code violators. What I found was pure gold, especially when cross-referenced with demographic data. Rebecca owned 3 rental properties in our city through an LLC called Sterling Property Solutions, and the pattern was revealing. All 3 properties were in transitioning neighborhoods with increasing minority populations. All 3 had been systematically allowed to deteriorate, creating justification for demolition and redevelopment. I'd actually written several of the inspection protocols she was about to become intimately familiar with. Cross-referencing violation histories, I discovered something beautiful: 3 active code violations on her duplex rental at 847 Maple Street, in a predominantly Latino neighborhood she was clearly trying to flip. Unpermitted bathroom addition from 2019. Outdated electrical panel creating fire hazards. Blocked fire exit due to illegal storage unit placement. All violations I'd personally flagged for follow-up that somehow never got addressed, probably because her tenants were undocumented and afraid to complain. In my experience, landlords who ignore safety violations in minority communities tend to get very motivated when their own liability gets exposed. I filed fresh complaints using Rebecca's own previous language, almost word for word, because I have that kind of sense of humor. The city inspector arrived at Rebecca's duplex on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there, of course, but public records tell a beautiful story. Violations confirmed, fines totaling $2,400, mandatory corrections within 30 days, or face tenant relocation assistance requirements. Her tenants, a hard-working Mexican family, received notices the same afternoon, along with information about their rights and resources for reporting discriminatory housing practices. Friday evening, I was loading groceries when Rebecca confronted me in the Walmart parking lot, and her mask finally came completely off. 3 witnesses, including Mrs. Henderson from our street, watched as our HOA president completely lost her composure and revealed the racial hatred that had been driving this campaign all along. "You think you're so smart with your little code book," she snarled, her voice carrying across rows of shopping carts. "Some problems can't be solved with paperwork, Jerome. Some neighborhoods have standards about who belongs and who doesn't. Your people might be fine in other parts of town, but this isn't the place for your kind." The parking lot went dead silent. Other shoppers backed away like we were radioactive, but several people had their phones out, recording what was clearly becoming a viral moment. "Are you threatening me, Mom?" I asked calmly, making sure my voice carried to our audience. "And are you saying this is about race?" "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice taking on the sharp edge of someone whose careful mask had finally slipped. "Accidents happen. House fires, gas leaks. Sometimes properties owned by certain people just develop problems. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere more suitable." Mrs. Henderson's gasp was audible from 20 feet away. "Rebecca Sterling," she called out, "are you actually threatening to burn down their house because they're black?" The word hung in the air like a lightning strike, making explicit what everyone had been dancing around. "I never said that," Rebecca backtracked, but the damage was done. By the time we got home, 3 different videos were already circulating on social media, and the hashtag #JoRacistHoKaren was trending locally. That night, Keisha and I sat on our back porch, watching the sunset paint our vegetable garden golden. The piece felt fragile now, like something beautiful that someone was planning to break because we didn't have the right skin color to deserve it. "The community is split," Keisha observed. "Half the neighborhood thinks we're dangerous criminals, and half thinks Rebecca's lost her mind. But everybody knows this is about race now." She was right. The HOA members had fractured into camps, but the lines were starkly racial. Team Rebecca was exclusively white transplants and investment property owners. Team Jerome was longtime residents of all races and younger families who recognized bigotry when they saw it. The neutrals were mostly retirees trying to avoid conflict, but even they were uncomfortable with how overtly racial this had become. But something else was happening that made my investigator instincts scream warnings. I'd started receiving anonymous calls at work, someone asking about my patrol schedule, my typical routes home, when I usually inspected properties. The caller always hung up before I could trace the number, but something about the voice reminded me of the wellness walk conversations I'd been overhearing. Then Malik mentioned something that made my blood freeze. "Dad, some lady in a white Range Rover asked me yesterday if you were home. She said she was from the HOA, but she called me boy and asked if we were planning to move somewhere more appropriate soon." That's when I realized this had moved beyond neighborhood dispute into something much more dangerous, and I started watching our security cameras a lot more carefully. The harassment was escalating, and the racial element was making it potentially deadly. Rebecca's next move proved she wasn't just vindictive, she was strategic, and she understood exactly how to weaponize racial bias in professional settings. If social pressure wouldn't work, she'd attack my livelihood directly by playing on every stereotype about black competence and corruption. Monday morning, my supervisor Dave called me into his office with the expression of a man delivering terminal diagnosis news. "Jerome, I need to talk to you about a formal complaint filed against you. The allegations were precise, professional, and devastating. Abuse of position, using city resources for personal vendettas, intimidating white citizens through selective enforcement, and engaging in discriminatory practices against longtime community members." Rebecca had provided evidence, timestamps showing my property research during work hours, copies of my complaints against her, even witness statements claiming I'd threatened her with regulatory retaliation because she's white, and I don't think white people should tell black people what to do. "You know this is bullshit," Dave said, sliding the paperwork across his desk, "but Internal Affairs has to investigate, especially when there are allegations about racial bias. I'm sorry, Jerome, but I have to reassign you pending review." The fluorescent conference room lights hummed like angry wasps during my 3-hour interview with Internal Affairs. Coffee grew cold while a stenographer's pen scratched across paper, documenting every question about my professional conduct and whether I'd ever used my position to target white residents or retaliate against community complaints. 25 years of spotless service reduced to timestamps and he said she said accusations, but now, with the added twist of reverse discrimination, claims that I knew would be taken seriously regardless of their merit. Temporary reassignment to minimize appearance of bias meant I'd be shuffling papers in the basement while Rebecca painted me as a corrupt official who couldn't handle white authority. The irony tasted bitter as burnt coffee, but I'd learned something during my years chasing down fraud cases and living while black in America. Desperate racists make bigger mistakes than any other kind of criminal. Time for my third counterpunch. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all city communications regarding my property, but I also requested any communications mentioning my race, my family's race, or any language about community character or neighborhood standards. What came back was a masterclass in coordinated harassment with a clear racial component. Rebecca hadn't just contacted my department. She'd reached out to the city attorney, mayor's office, planning commission, and health department. Same script every time, but with subtle racial coding that became obvious when viewed as a pattern. More importantly, this pattern matched exactly what I found in public records from her previous cities, but with a clear focus on minority-owned properties. The woman had turned racist harassment into a profitable business model. Rebecca's communications consistently questioned whether minority families could really afford properties in upscale neighborhoods, whether they had legitimate income sources, and whether their presence was compatible with community standards. The language was carefully chosen to avoid overt racism while triggering every racial bias held by city officials. Keisha started photographing every coincidental encounter. Rebecca jogging past our house 5 times daily, always slowing down to photograph our property, while on phone calls about documentation. Unfamiliar cars slowing at our driveway, white drivers who'd point and take pictures before driving away, neighbors who suddenly needed to walk their dogs right by our fence, making comments about interesting smells and unusual activities. We instructed the twins to record any adult who approached them with questions about our family, and the pattern was disturbing. Every single approach included questions about where we were originally from and whether we were planning to stay in the area. I installed a comprehensive security system, every camera and sensor legal as property owner surveillance. The red blinking of motion detectors mixed with the digital hum of recording equipment, turning our peaceful home into something that felt like a fortress. But the psychological pressure was working exactly as Rebecca intended, and the racial element made it exponentially worse. Sleep came in fragments between checking camera feeds and worrying about what our kids were hearing at school. Keisha jumped at unexpected noises. The kids asked why we couldn't just be normal neighbors like everyone else, not understanding that some people would never let us be normal because of our skin color. Then came the emergency HOA board meeting, where Rebecca planned to make her racial motivations official policy. Our neighbor Terry Wilson, one of the fence sitters trying to avoid taking sides, knocked on our door Thursday evening with information that made my stomach drop. "They're calling for a vote tomorrow night," he said, shifting nervously on our porch. "Something about hiring a property management company to deal with incompatible residents and cultural conflicts. Rebecca's got 3 new board members who moved in last month from Connecticut, all from her old neighborhood, and she's pushing for demographic compatibility assessments and emergency assessment authority." Translation: they wanted to hire professional intimidation services with legal cover, and they wanted to make racial exclusion official policy. I'd seen this in other cities. Companies that specialized in making minority-owned properties developed problems until owners sold below market value and moved to more appropriate areas. 3 longtime board members had already resigned rather than participate in what one called legalized segregation disguised as property management. Friday brought a new escalation that crossed every line and made the racial targeting unmistakable. At 9:47 p.m., police arrived at our house responding to a domestic disturbance call. We were having dinner on our back porch, hardly the stuff of violent crime, but the responding officer, someone I'd worked with for years, looked embarrassed and angry. "Jerome, this is the 3rd false emergency call this month," Officer Rodriguez said, checking our obviously peaceful household. "Someone's been calling in reports about aggressive black male and potential domestic violence and loud urban music disturbing the peace. All bullshit, but we have to respond." I knew from my enforcement training that filing false emergency reports is a felony charge, carrying up to 2 years in prison. But when those false reports specifically invoke racial stereotypes to trigger police response, federal hate crime statutes come into play. More troubling, several 911 calls had included language about suspicious activity and people who don't belong in the neighborhood. Clear attempts to weaponize police response based on racial bias. My evidence file had grown to fill an entire cabinet. False reports, harassment timelines, financial research on Rebecca, pattern analysis from other cities, and now a growing collection of racially motivated incidents that painted a picture of systematic discrimination disguised as community standards. Keisha found me there one night, organizing documents like I was preparing for war. "You're building a case like you're expecting federal court," she observed. "Because I think that's exactly where this is heading," I replied, holding up property transfer records that showed the real scope of Rebecca's operation and its consistent targeting of minority homeowners. "And because I think this is about more than money, it's about a woman who believes she can drive black families out of neighborhoods through legal terrorism." Then Sunday morning brought the escalation that turned harassment into attempted murder, with a clear hate crime component. I found our chickens dead in their coop, their water contaminated with antifreeze. But this wasn't random vandalism. Someone had also spray-painted racial slurs on our workshop wall and left a handwritten note: "Norhues don't belong in this neighborhood. Move or be moved." The acrid chemical smell burned my nostrils as I knelt beside birds that had been our family's daily joy, while staring at hatred literally written on our property. Malik's tears mixed with my rage as we buried justice, liberty, and hope, names the kids had chosen that now seem prophetic. The veterinary report confirmed antifreeze poisoning, but the hate crime evidence was what really mattered. Security footage showed 2 figures in dark clothes entering our property at 3:07 a.m., one clearly female based on body shape and gait, 2 blurred for definitive identification, but the height and build matched Rebecca perfectly. The racial slurs were written in the same precise handwriting I'd seen on dozens of HOA complaints. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered the vandalism wasn't random teenage mischief. It was part of a coordinated campaign with racial intimidation at its core. Our workshop door had been spray-painted with "Move" in red letters, along with symbols I recognized from FBI hate crime training materials. Security footage caught both perpetrators, and when I tracked down their license plate through traffic cameras, the trail led directly back to Rebecca's social circle. Instead of pressing charges immediately, I documented everything and added it to my growing case file. The real target wasn't confused teenagers or hired vandals. It was the adult orchestrating a criminal conspiracy based on racial hatred. "Keisha," I said that night, spreading bank records, timeline charts, and hate crime evidence across our kitchen table, "we're not dealing with neighborly harassment anymore. We're dealing with organized crime with a racial motivation, and that means federal jurisdiction. 3 a.m. is when the best detective work happens, especially when you're a black man fighting a racist conspiracy, and you know nobody will believe you without perfect documentation. When your brain is tired enough to see patterns it normally misses, and desperate enough to dig through archives most people ignore." I was hunched over my home office computer, surrounded by empty coffee cups and highlighted documents, when Keisha shuffled in wearing her bathrobe and concerned expression. "Still hunting for your smoking gun?" she asked, setting down fresh coffee that smelled like salvation. "More like hunting for the puppet master," I muttered, clicking through municipal contract archives I'd accessed through my city login. Because nothing about this feels random anymore, and everything about it feels coordinated around one central belief, that successful black families don't belong in white neighborhoods. That's when I found it, buried in filing cabinets most people never knew existed. The original HOA incorporation documents from 2018 contained a clause I'd never seen before: Emergency Property Acquisition Protocol for Demographic Compatibility Management. The language was dense legal speak that basically translated to one terrifying concept: the HOA board could force the sale of any property deemed a community threat or culturally incompatible through municipal partnership agreements. It was legalized racial exclusion disguised as property management. Keisha read over my shoulder, her principal's training helping her decode bureaucratic language that was designed to hide discriminatory intent. "Emergency eminent domain," she whispered, "but specifically targeting families they consider racially incompatible. Can they actually do that?" I was already cross-referencing signatures on the incorporation papers. City Council member Patricia Webb had signed off on the HOA's legal structure, including the demographic compatibility language. The same Patricia Webb who currently chaired our zoning appeals board and voted on eminent domain cases. Webb's background made my investigator instinct start screaming, and the racial pattern was unmistakable. Former business partner with Rebecca in Connecticut, current position controlling property acquisition appeals, and a voting record that consistently favored developers in cases involving minority homeowners. She'd never declared this relationship as a conflict of interest, and she'd never explained her consistent pattern of voting against minority property owners. "Keisha, look at this," I said, pulling up property transfer records, cross-referenced with demographic data. Similar HOA structures in Stamford, Phoenix, Tucson, all cities where Rebecca operated before. Same legal framework, same acquisition protocols, same demographic compatibility language, same mysterious property problems affecting minority families. The pattern was breathtaking in its scope and racist precision. Target non-conforming properties owned by minorities, manufacture community crises using racial dog whistles, force buyouts through emergency procedures that bypass normal appeals while using coded language about community character. The properties were then resold to developers at 300% markup through shell companies, ensuring the new developments would attract exclusively white buyers through price point and marketing strategy. Elena's research skills proved invaluable here, but now we had a racial angle to explore. Using school district databases she had access to, she started tracing property transfers across state lines, cross-referenced with demographic data. What emerged was a business model disguised as community activism, but with a clear racial component that made it exponentially more profitable and legally vulnerable. "Jerome, look at these numbers," she said, highlighting transfer amounts on her laptop. 7 properties across 3 cities, all following the same timeline, all previously owned by minority families. They've made an estimated $2.1 million over 5 years. But more importantly, every single targeted property was owned by successful Black or Latino families in predominantly white neighborhoods. This isn't random, it's systematic racial targeting for profit. But the smoking gun came when I discovered recent changes to our city's fire inspection protocols. Changes that seemed specifically designed to target properties like ours, while providing cover for racial discrimination. New policies required properties with non-traditional agricultural elements to undergo quarterly inspections, policies authored by Councilwoman Webb and enacted exactly 60 days ago, 1 month before Rebecca's first complaint against us. The language was carefully coded, but the intent was clear: create additional regulatory burden for properties that didn't fit white suburban norms. The timing was surgical in its precision. Property tax records revealed Rebecca's shell company, Willowbrook Development LLC, incorporated 3 months ago, with the stated purpose of residential property acquisition and neighborhood demographic management. Financial backing traced to an anonymous investment fund that led back to her Connecticut partners, all white investors who specialized in urban transition projects. Target properties, my home and 2 other minority-owned parcels, worth a combined $1.8 million. But the demographic research revealed the real scope. Rebecca's fund was specifically targeting successful minority families in upscale neighborhoods across Texas, using HOA harassment campaigns to force below-market sales. "Keisha," I said, leaning back in my chair as the full scope hit me like a physical blow, "they're not trying to get me to join the HOA. They're not even just trying to steal my property. They're trying to keep successful Black families out of white neighborhoods, and they've turned racist harassment into a profitable business model. The harassment, the false reports, the social pressure campaign, none of it was about community standards or property values. It was about racial exclusion disguised as legitimate business practice, systematic discrimination that generated massive profits while maintaining plausible deniability. So what do we do now?" Keisha asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what we'd uncovered. I looked at the evidence spread across our desk: municipal violations, undisclosed conflicts of interest, interstate fraud patterns, conspiracy to interfere with property rights, and now federal civil rights violations that would trigger RICO charges and hate crime enhancements. Then I smiled for the first time in weeks. "We use the law exactly the way it was meant to be used," I said, reaching for my phone. "Time to call in some favors and build a case that will make federal prosecutors and civil rights attorneys very, very happy. Because racists who turn discrimination into business models have committed federal crimes that carry serious time. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And unlike Rebecca, I actually knew how to follow the rules while documenting racism so thoroughly that even skeptical prosecutors would have to take action. Time to assemble my team, but this time with specialists who understood both financial crimes and civil rights violations. And, lucky for me, 25 years in municipal enforcement, plus a lifetime of dealing with racism, had earned me some very useful friends in both areas. First call went to Jake Morrison, my old college roommate who'd become an investigative reporter specializing in racial discrimination cases. I'd fed him tips on municipal corruption for years, but this was his area of expertise. "Jerome, it's 3:30 in the morning," Jake's groggy voice came through the phone. "Jake, remember that favor you owe me from the city council bribery story? Time to collect. How'd you like to expose a multi-state property fraud conspiracy with a clear racial component that's been systematically targeting minority homeowners?" Suddenly he sounded wide awake. "With federal civil rights violations? I'll be there in an hour." Second call, Carmen Rodriguez, Keisha's law school friend who'd built a career fighting both property rights violations and housing discrimination. She specialized in taking on big corporations that bullied homeowners, with additional expertise in civil rights law that made her perfect for this case. Pro bono case with national implications for HOA overreach and racial discrimination in housing, Carmen said after I explained the situation. "Jerome, you had me at federal conspiracy charges, but you really got my attention with systematic racial targeting. This is exactly the kind of case that changes precedent and protects other families." Third call, Tom Morgan, a forensic accountant whose elderly parents I'd helped navigate code compliance issues last year, but who also had experience tracing money in discrimination cases. Tom could trace financial flows through shell companies while documenting the racial patterns that made this a federal civil rights violation. Someone tried to steal your house through legal fraud based on racial targeting. Tom's voice carried the indignation of someone who took both financial crimes and racism personally. Oh, we're going to nail these people to the wall and make sure they never target another minority family again. Fourth call. The new addition to my team, Dr. Angela Hayes, a civil rights attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center, who specialized in housing discrimination and hate crimes. Carmen had recommended her after hearing the full scope of our evidence. Mr. Washington, Dr. Hayes said after I explained our situation, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of systematic housing discrimination disguised as community standards enforcement. If your documentation is as thorough as you describe, this could be one of the most important civil rights cases in housing discrimination we've seen in years. By dawn, my workshop had been converted into a war room that would make both FBI financial crimes, task forces, and civil rights divisions jealous. Bulletin boards covered every wall, connected with colored string mapping relationships between players. Financial flowcharts traced money movements across state lines. Timeline boards showed the progression from racial harassment to attempted murder. A separate board documented every instance of racial coding, discriminatory language, and civil rights violations. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the rustle of document pages and the scratch of markers on whiteboards as we built our case, but now with the added dimension of federal civil rights law that transformed local harassment into national precedent. Carmen spread legal precedents across my workbench like a general planning invasion strategy. Civil conspiracy requires 3 elements, she explained, highlighting relevant case law. But housing discrimination cases require additional documentation of racial intent and systematic targeting. We have recorded conversations proving racial motivation, documented harassment showing discriminatory patterns, and property devaluation plus emotional distress for damages. But more importantly, we have evidence of interstate conspiracy to violate civil rights through housing discrimination. Dr. Hayes added the civil rights dimension that transformed our case from local property dispute to federal precedent. The Civil Rights Act makes it a federal crime to conspire to interfere with housing rights based on race, she explained, while photographing our evidence boards. Your documentation shows clear intent to exclude minority homeowners through systematic harassment, combined with the interstate business model targeting minority properties. This triggers both RICO violations and federal hate crime statutes. Tom's laptop hummed as he traced financial connections through public records, but now with demographic overlays that revealed the racial targeting pattern. The Corporate Transparency Act requires shell companies to file beneficial ownership reports, Tom announced, pulling up incorporation documents cross-referenced with property transfer data. $4.2 million investment fund, 7 silent partners, all with addresses in Connecticut, 2 with previous fraud investigations. And here's the beautiful part, all 7 have been involved in previous neighborhood transition projects that specifically targeted minority homeowners in gentrifying areas. Jake outlined his media strategy while photographing our evidence boards, but with the added angle of racial discrimination that would guarantee national attention. I'm calling this series the HOA Hustle, How Racism Became a Real Estate Business Model, he announced. Local story with national civil rights implications. HOA abuse affects 73 million Americans, but systematic racial targeting in housing affects fundamental constitutional rights. We coordinate publication with your legal filings for maximum impact, but I'm also reaching out to national civil rights organizations who'll want to make this a test case. I'd upgraded our security system with professional-grade equipment, taking advantage of Texas's one-party consent laws for recording conversations. But now I was also documenting every instance of racial harassment, every coded conversation about community character, and every interaction that revealed discriminatory intent. Anyone who stepped foot on our property was now being documented in high definition with backup cloud storage, creating an evidence file that would be bulletproof in federal court. As I'd learned from years of building legal cases and decades of living while Black in America, good documentation plus clear evidence of racial discrimination beats even the best lawyers when federal civil rights law gets involved. Keisha organized a concerned parents' coffee meeting, ostensibly to discuss school safety issues. Her real purpose was identifying HOA members uncomfortable with Rebecca's increasingly overt racial targeting. 3 families quietly provided internal HOA communications that revealed not just fractures in Rebecca's support base, but documented discussions about demographic management and maintaining community character that would be devastating in federal court. The intelligence goldmine, an emergency board meeting scheduled for Friday, where Rebecca planned to force a vote on demographic compatibility assessments and property acquisition proceedings that would essentially legalize racial exclusion through HOA authority. Our evidence package grew into 4 distinct attack vectors: criminal referral to the district attorney for wire fraud, conspiracy and filing false reports, civil complaint for conspiracy to interfere with property rights, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, ethics complaint against Councilwoman Webb for undisclosed conflicts of interest, federal civil rights complaint documenting systematic housing discrimination based on race. Carmen coordinated our timing with military precision, but now with federal civil rights law creating additional leverage. T-4 days, we file the federal civil rights complaint, establishes federal jurisdiction, and triggers FBI involvement. T-3 days, ethics complaint forces Webb to recuse herself from any property votes. T-2 days, civil lawsuit creates public record and triggers media interest. T-1 day, criminal referral escalates to law enforcement matter. T-day, Jake's story publishes with civil rights angle and creates maximum public pressure. But we needed inside access to Friday's emergency HOA meeting, where Rebecca planned to make racial exclusion official policy. That's where our neighbor Terry Wilson, still trying to stay neutral but increasingly horrified by the racial implications, proved invaluable. HOA meetings were technically public under state law, and Terry agreed to attend with his phone streaming live video. If they vote for demographic compatibility requirements, I explained to the team, we'll have real-time evidence of conspiracy to violate civil rights in action. We prepared backup plans for every scenario. If the legal strategy failed, media exposure would destroy Rebecca's business model and create national conversation about racism in HOAs. If they accelerated their timeline, we had emergency injunction papers ready to file in both state and federal court. If they tried targeting team members, Tom had already established contact with FBI Civil Rights Division and Interstate Fraud Division. Personal preparations felt like preparing for siege warfare, but with the added dimension of protecting our family from racially motivated violence. Keisha took leave from school. The twins went to stay with grandparents after we explained that some people didn't think black families belonged in certain neighborhoods, and that sometimes those people became dangerous. I arranged temporary security for Keisha's workplace and established a legal defense fund from our savings, plus contributions from other families who'd faced similar racial targeting. The final piece fell into place when Carmen and Dr. Hayes discovered precedent from a similar case in Nevada that had resulted in $2.3 million in civil rights damages. Washington versus Sterling is going to become landmark civil rights case law, Dr. Hayes said with satisfaction. Win or lose, this fight changes how both HOAs operate nationwide and how federal civil rights law applies to housing discrimination disguised as community standards. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly, but with the added weight of knowing we were fighting not just for our property, but for the right of minority families to live anywhere they could afford, without facing systematic racial harassment. Keisha found me checking equipment one final time. "Ready for war?" she asked. I looked at our evidence, our team, our legally bulletproof strategy that now included federal civil rights violations that would make this case a national precedent. Then I smiled. "Keisha, I've been ready for this fight my entire career and my entire life as a black man in America. Time to show these people what happens when they pick on someone who actually knows the rules and won't be intimidated by racism disguised as community standards." If I thought Rebecca was desperate before, I was about to learn what real desperation looked like when a racist conspiracy faces federal civil rights charges. And honestly, it was terrifying in its creativity and violence. Tuesday morning brought news that made my blood run cold and confirmed that we were dealing with people willing to commit serious crimes to maintain white supremacy in housing. Rebecca's home had been burglarized overnight, a break-in so convenient it practically had neon signs reading "evidence destruction" and "false flag operation." According to her police report, the thieves had stolen membership files, financial records, and her computer hard drive. Nothing valuable like jewelry or electronics, mind you. Just the exact documents that would contain evidence of her harassment campaign and racial targeting. But she'd also claimed that threatening materials had been left behind, materials that portrayed our family as dangerous criminals who needed to be dealt with. But here's where Rebecca showed her amateur hour while revealing the depth of her racial paranoia. She filed an insurance claim the same day, listing items that were never mentioned to police, but also filed a report with police claiming she'd received threatening communications from urban gang members, a barely coded reference to our family that was designed to trigger every racist stereotype about black criminality. The responding detective, a sharp black woman named Lisa Park, seemed skeptical from the start and recognized the racial implications immediately. "Ma'am, this doesn't look like a real burglary," she told Rebecca during questioning. "Nothing valuable taken, no signs of forced entry. Your security system was mysteriously malfunctioning, and your description of these supposed gang threats sounds like something from a 1980s crime drama. Are you sure you're not trying to create justification for additional police attention on your neighbors?" When Detective Park interviewed me about my suspicious activity and whether I had any associates who might have been involved, I had an ironclad alibi, and the detective's questions made it clear she understood exactly what Rebecca was trying to do. Family dinner at Keisha's parents', complete with restaurant receipts and security footage showing me 20 miles away during the supposed break-in. More importantly, Detective Park was familiar with similar cases where white residents had filed false reports designed to justify police harassment of minority neighbors. Jake's journalism contacts at the insurance company confirmed what I suspected. Rebecca had increased her coverage by 400% just 2 weeks earlier, specifically adding coverage for hate crime damages and community violence. The same pattern had emerged in her previous cities before accidents started happening to properties owned by minority families who refused to sell. Filing fraudulent insurance claims is a felony, but filing false police reports designed to trigger racial profiling is a federal civil rights violation that escalates misdemeanor harassment into serious federal territory. Rebecca had just handed us another rope for her legal hanging while revealing the depth of her racial hatred. Her next move was pure theater designed to weaponize community racial fears. An emergency community safety meeting in the HOA clubhouse focused on urban crime spillover and demographic security concerns. 40-plus residents showed up, along with a police liaison and city council observer. The smell of fear and expensive perfume mixed with the artificial vanilla scent of those plug-in air fresheners that make everything smell like a department store. Rebecca's PowerPoint presentation was masterful racist propaganda, professional slides about property value protection and community safety, complete with carefully edited photos of our property that made our workshop look like a crack house and our chicken coop resemble a criminal hideout, crime statistics that focused exclusively on minority perpetrators, demographic studies showing declining property values in transitioning neighborhoods, references to urban cultural conflicts and incompatible lifestyle patterns. "We're not here to persecute anyone," she said with practiced sincerity that fooled exactly no one who understood coded racist language. "We're here to protect our children and our investments from neighbors whose background and cultural practices create safety concerns and property value risks. Some families are simply better suited to different types of neighborhoods." But I'd come prepared with Carmen and Dr. Hayes, who introduced themselves as family attorneys specializing in civil rights violations, in a voice that could cut glass. My statement was calm, factual, and devastating. A timeline of racial harassment backed by documentation that made several residents gasp audibly and others shift uncomfortably as they recognized their own coded language reflected back at them. Photos of poisoned chickens with racial slurs, copies of false police reports designed to trigger racial profiling, financial records showing Rebecca's shell companies and their history of targeting minority homeowners, property research showing her pattern across multiple states of systematically driving out successful Black and Latino families, recorded conversations containing explicit racial language and threats. "Ladies and gentlemen," I concluded, looking directly into the eyes of neighbors who'd participated in this harassment, "this isn't about community standards. This is about organized racial discrimination disguised as neighborly concern. This is about a business model based on the belief that successful minority families don't belong in certain neighborhoods. And this is about federal crimes that carry serious prison time. The audience reaction was everything I'd hoped for, but split along predictable racial lines. Shocked murmurs from white residents who genuinely hadn't understood the racial implications. Knowing nods from minority residents who'd recognized the patterns immediately, and visible discomfort from white residents who'd participated, but were now realizing they might have committed federal crimes. Several longtime residents approached afterward to apologize privately for believing Rebecca's narrative, but also to share their own experiences with her racial comments and demographic concerns that they'd previously dismissed as mere snobbery. But the real payoff came in the parking lot, where Rebecca confronted me beside my truck and completely revealed her racial motivations in front of 6 witnesses, including Terry Wilson with his phone recording. "You think you're so smart," she snarled, her voice carrying across the asphalt with a venom that made several people step back. "Some problems can't be solved with paperwork, Jerome. Sometimes neighborhoods have to be protected from people who don't belong, people whose very presence threatens everything decent families have built. Your kind might think you can move anywhere you want, but there are still places where standards matter." The words hung in the night air like toxic smoke, but she wasn't finished. "Insurance companies pay out all the time for house fires, gas leaks, accidents that happen to families who don't know their place. Sometimes people just need to learn that some neighborhoods aren't meant for them." 6 residents heard her make a specific threat to my property, combined with explicit racial language that transformed criminal conspiracy into federal hate crimes. Terry's phone captured every word in high-definition audio that would play beautifully in federal court. In my 25 years of law enforcement training, plus a lifetime of experiencing racism, I'd learned that threats to property combined with racial animus constitute federal civil rights violations, especially when the threatener had a documented history of targeting minority families. Wednesday morning brought official escalation that proved our federal conspiracy theory and revealed the institutional racism that enabled Rebecca's business model. I received a certified letter from the City Planning Office, preliminary assessment for emergency property acquisition proceedings, demographic compatibility review, signature, Councilwoman Patricia Webb, timeline, 72 hours for property owner response, translation, the legal framework for racially motivated forced sale had been activated. Webb's involvement was the smoking gun we needed, but now with clear evidence of institutional racism. Her undisclosed business relationship with Rebecca, combined with official abuse of eminent domain procedures, specifically targeting minority homeowners, violated multiple federal statutes about public corruption and civil rights. The demographic compatibility review language was barely coded racial exclusion that would be impossible to defend in federal court. Carmen and Dr. Hayes immediately filed for emergency injunction in federal court, while Tom traced the money trail showing direct financial benefit to Webb through acquisitions that specifically targeted minority-owned properties. The forensic accounting revealed a kickback scheme based on racial targeting that made my municipal enforcement training feel like kindergarten compared to the sophisticated discrimination we were uncovering. But Thursday brought the discovery that made me realize we were running out of time and that Rebecca's racial hatred was driving her toward potentially deadly violence. Tom's financial analysis revealed something that made my hands shake and confirmed our worst fears about racially motivated terrorism. Rebecca had increased fire insurance on neighboring properties by 400% in the past month, specifically targeting properties owned by minority families. Her stated reason, concerned about potential fire spread from incompatible agricultural and cultural practices. She wasn't just planning to force us out through legal proceedings, she was expecting or planning fires at multiple minority-owned properties, using racial stereotypes about dangerous urban practices as cover. The insurance paperwork was dated 1 week before her first harassment complaint, but included specific language about cultural fire hazards and non-traditional cooking and heating practices that revealed both her business plan and her racist assumptions. The woman had been planning racially motivated arson from day one. New security footage confirmed our worst fears and revealed the scope of the racist conspiracy. The same rental truck had circled our property and the Johnsons' property, the other black family, at 2 a.m. for 3 consecutive nights. license plate traced to a company paid for with cash using fake identification. Two white men with surveying equipment and cameras had been mapping both minority-owned properties, not for inspection, but for operational planning. Keisha's discovery at school made everything click into terrifying focus and revealed how deeply the racial targeting extended into community institutions. Maintenance reports mentioned chemical smell complaints from school buses passing our street and the predominantly Latino neighborhood where Rebecca owned rental properties. Timeline matched perfectly with diesel fuel odors concentrated near storm drains around minority-owned properties throughout our area. Someone had been placing accelerants around multiple neighborhoods with significant minority populations, creating a pattern that would allow Rebecca to claim urban crime spillover and demographic security threats, while profiting from the forced sales that would follow. Friday evening, I found diesel-soaked rags in storm drains near our house, the Johnsons' property, and two Latino-owned homes on the other side of our neighborhood, all strategically placed near natural gas meters and electrical junction boxes. Professional arson setup designed to look like accidents, but clearly targeting minority homeowners based on racial demographics. I called Carmen and Dr. Hayes with hands that barely worked. We're out of time. They're planning multiple fires targeting every minority homeowner in our area. This isn't just about our property anymore. It's about racial terrorism designed to drive all minority families out of this neighborhood. Time for the most dangerous chess move of my life, letting them think they'd won, while documenting federal hate crimes in real time. I evacuated Keisha and the twins to her sister's house under the cover story of a romantic weekend getaway. Social media posts showed happy family photos from 30 miles away. While I prepared for what might be the longest and most dangerous night of my career, Jake and I established our surveillance position in the abandoned barn across the creek, close enough to capture everything, far enough to stay safe if things went sideways, but now with backup from FBI civil rights investigators who'd been quietly building their own case based on our documentation. Our equipment looked like something from a spy movie crossed with a federal civil rights investigation. Night vision cameras capable of identifying faces and recording audio. Direct lines to both Fire Department Dispatch and FBI Civil Rights Division. Backup power systems in case they cut our electricity. And most importantly, federal agents positioned throughout the neighborhood to ensure arrests would stick and evidence would be preserved for civil rights prosecutions. The waiting was brutal, made worse by knowing this was about more than property fraud. It was about racial terrorism designed to keep minority families in their place. Every sound made my pulse spike. Wind through trees, distant cars, the creak of old wood settling, the smell of October night air mixed with diesel fumes still lingering from their preparation work, and the weight of knowing that federal hate crimes were about to be committed. 2:17 a.m. brought the rental truck we'd been tracking for weeks, plus two additional vehicles that hadn't been in our previous surveillance. Four men in dark clothing emerged like shadows, moving with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd done this before. They parked 2 blocks away and approached multiple properties on foot, ours, the Johnsons, and 2 Latino-owned homes. My hands shook as I adjusted camera angles to capture faces clearly, while FBI agents documented from their positions. These weren't local kids hired for vandalism. This was coordinated racial terrorism, probably costing Rebecca $50,000 minimum, but designed to drive out every minority family in our neighborhood, while providing cover for profitable redevelopment. Jake whispered commentary into his recorder, while I documented everything through high-definition video capable of supporting federal hate crime prosecutions. License plate numbers, physical descriptions, methodology, racial targeting patterns, evidence that would hold up in federal court and establish precedent for civil rights enforcement in housing discrimination cases. The accelerant placement was sickeningly systematic and revealed the racist logic behind their targeting. Foundation corners first on every minority-owned property, creating a pattern that would suggest urban gang activity or cultural conflicts. Workshop walls and garages second, targeting areas associated with non-traditional activities. Finally, areas around electrical meters and gas lines on properties owned by families of color, creating maximum destruction while maintaining cover story about dangerous cultural practices. Timing devices suggested they wanted fires to start after dawn, when neighbors would assume minority families were inside sleeping, maximizing both property damage and potential loss of life, while creating community trauma that would discourage other minority families from moving into the neighborhood. 47 minutes from arrival to departure across multiple properties, long enough to ensure complete destruction of every targeted home, short enough to avoid detection, systematic enough to create the racial terrorism that was clearly the point. My restraint nearly broke watching them douse the workshop where I'd built Malik's treehouse and restored Keisha's grandmother's rocking chair, but premature intervention would only get me arrested while letting the real criminals escape. More importantly, federal agents needed to document the full scope of the racially motivated conspiracy. 3:15 a.m., I called the fire department with reports of suspicious chemical smells at multiple locations throughout our neighborhood. Response time was 6 minutes, fast enough to prevent ignition, slow enough that the arsonists were gone, coordinated enough with FBI agents to ensure arrests would happen simultaneously across the conspiracy. Fire Marshal Rodriguez, who'd worked with me on previous investigations, took one look at the setup and whistled low, while federal agents began processing the scene as a civil rights crime. Jerome, this would have looked like coordinated gang activity or cultural conflicts, but burned hot enough to kill everyone sleeping inside, he said, photographing timing devices and accelerant patterns that clearly targeted minority homeowners. Professional job designed for maximum casualties and community intimidation. Someone paid serious money for racial terrorism. The four perpetrators made their fatal mistake at the 24-hour diner 4 miles away, celebrating what they thought was successful preparation for eliminating minority families from our neighborhood. Security cameras caught them discussing their payment schedule, their next targets in other cities, and their satisfaction with contributing to neighborhood improvement and demographic management. When state and federal agents arrested them, based on our surveillance and FBI coordination, they had fake IDs, $15,000 total in sequential bills, burner phones with contacts tracing to Rebecca's investment network, and detailed plans for similar operations in 3 other Texas cities with growing minority populations. Charges included conspiracy to commit arson with hate crime enhancements, attempted destruction of property based on racial targeting, crossing state lines to commit federal civil rights violations, and conspiracy to interfere with housing rights based on race. Federal crimes carrying 25-year sentences with hate crime enhancements. 5 a.m. brought my favorite part of the entire ordeal, Rebecca's arrest on federal civil rights charges. FBI agents caught her at the interstate on-ramp with suitcases, her laptop, and detailed files on minority homeowners across 3 states she was planning to target next. The USB drive in her purse contained property valuations organized by racial demographics, acquisition timelines prioritizing minority-owned properties, and communications with arsonists that included specific instructions to make it look like typical urban problems. Additional federal charges, flight to avoid prosecution, conspiracy to commit fraud based on racial discrimination, interstate transportation of evidence in civil rights violations, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights through intimidation and violence. 6 a.m. brought the moment that would define this case as landmark civil rights precedent. Jake's story went live with the headline, HOA President Arrested in Racially Motivated Arson Plot. Federal Hate Crimes Investigation Exposes Systematic Housing Discrimination. By noon, CNN, Fox News, NBC, and civil rights organizations nationwide had requested interviews. Social media exploded with racist HOA arson trending nationally and internationally. The political and civil rights fallout was swift and comprehensive. Councilwoman Webb submitted her resignation at 10 a.m., with FBI agents serving search warrants on her office. The Department of Justice announced a broader investigation into racially motivated housing discrimination disguised as municipal policy. The mayor called an emergency press conference to announce complete review of all HOA-related city policies and zero tolerance for discrimination in housing practices. The remaining HOA board members held their own emergency meeting, unanimously voting to dissolve all acquisition protocols and publicly apologizing for participating in what they now recognized as systematic racial discrimination. Their public apology took out full-page newspaper ads, acknowledging wrongdoing and promising $75,000 in restitution to affected families, along with funding for civil rights education programs. Federal prosecutors announced RICO charges were pending against the entire network, organized criminal enterprise operating across state lines to defraud property owners through racially motivated harassment and terrorism. Asset seizure orders froze all properties acquired through discriminatory schemes, with funds going into a victim restitution account specifically for minority families affected by housing discrimination. Carmen and Dr. Hayes' federal civil rights lawsuit was shaping up to exceed $2.3 million in damages and would establish precedent for future housing discrimination cases involving HOA abuse. Rebecca faced losing her real estate licenses in all 3 states, plus federal hate crime charges that could result in decades in prison. But the most satisfying moment came when other minority families started coming forward with their own harassment stories, revealing the true scope of racially motivated HOA abuse nationwide. 12 families across our city had been systematically targeted over 2 years using identical methods specifically designed to drive successful minority homeowners out of predominantly white neighborhoods. The pattern was finally broken, and federal civil rights law would ensure it couldn't be replicated. The professional racist predator had become federal prey, and her systematic discrimination had become the evidence that would protect minority families nationwide. Keisha found me that evening sitting on our back porch, watching the sunset paint our saved vegetable garden in golden light, while news crews interviewed neighbors about residential segregation and civil rights in America. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like justice," I said, raising my coffee cup in a toast to the security cameras that had captured everything, and the federal agents who'd ensured civil rights law would be enforced. Slow, methodical, legally bulletproof justice that will protect other families who look like us. The courthouse steps had never seen a crowd like this. 400 supporters, including civil rights activists, news crews from 6 cities, and enough reporters to staff a major newspaper. The morning air buzzed with camera shutters clicking like electronic insects, and microphones thrust forward seeking statements about housing discrimination and federal civil rights enforcement. Keisha, Malik, Zara, and I walked up those steps with the calm confidence of people who'd done everything by the book, while fighting racism that most people pretended didn't exist anymore. The twins had insisted on coming, wanting to see justice happen in real life, and understanding now that some fights are about more than personal grievances. They're about civil rights that protect everyone. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Morrison read the charges against Rebecca with the gravity they deserved, emphasizing the civil rights violations that made this case federal precedent. 23 felony counts including conspiracy, attempted arson with hate crime enhancements, wire fraud, interstate criminal enterprise, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of civil rights based on race. 12 misdemeanor counts for filing false reports and harassment with racial motivation. Rebecca's appearance shocked everyone who'd known her as the polished HOA president. Orange federal jumpsuit, handcuffs, and the defeated posture of someone whose carefully constructed world of white supremacy had collapsed under federal civil rights law. The perfectly styled hair looked unwashed, and her famous composure had cracked like cheap paint under the weight of hate crime charges. Federal prosecutor David Morgan laid out the case with prosecutorial precision, enhanced by civil rights expertise. The defendant orchestrated a systematic campaign of racially motivated harassment, fraud, and attempted terrorism, spanning multiple states and involving millions of dollars in discriminatory property transfers. This case represents not just individual criminal behavior, but systematic violation of federal civil rights laws designed to ensure equal access to housing regardless of race. Bail was set at $500,000, reflecting both flight risk and the severity of federal hate crime charges. Rebecca's family sat in stunned silence as the woman who'd terrorized minority families across multiple states was led away in federal custody. The press conference afterward felt like vindication with national civil rights implications. We stood on the courthouse lawn with our burned property visible in the background, a perfect visual reminder of how far racial hatred disguised as community standards could go. Jake had coordinated with national civil rights organizations, turning our local story into a symbol of ongoing housing discrimination and the need for federal civil rights enforcement in suburban America. "This was never about HOAs versus property rights," I said, looking directly into the CNN camera, while civil rights attorneys nodded approval. This was about criminals using community organizations as cover for racial discrimination. This was about systematic attempts to prevent minority families from living in neighborhoods they could afford through harassment that escalated to attempted terrorism. Good neighbors don't threaten each other, and they definitely don't target families because of their race. The first reporter's question hit exactly the civil rights note I'd expected. Mr. Washington, how does it feel to see your tormentor facing federal hate crime charges? Honestly, I feel sad that racism still operates this way in America, I replied, meaning every word. Keisha and I just wanted to live peacefully and raise our children in the neighborhood where my grandfather farmed. We never asked for this fight, but we're grateful that federal civil rights law exists to protect families like ours. Dr. Hayes stepped up to the microphone, Forrest, with the natural authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting housing discrimination. The message this case sends is simple. Federal civil rights law will be enforced. Housing discrimination disguised as community standards is still illegal, and anyone who thinks they can profit from racial targeting in housing will face the full weight of federal prosecution. The community support was overwhelming and revealed how many people understood the civil rights implications. Neighbors held signs reading, "Housing rights are civil rights," and "Integration is American." Malik and Zara's classmates had come with their parents, turning the courthouse lawn into something resembling a civil rights rally. In a moment that perfectly captured the progress we'd made, Mrs. Patterson brought replacements for our poisoned chickens, 2 heritage breed birds she'd researched specifically to honor our grandfather's farming tradition. The gentle clucking mixed with children's laughter and reporters discussing federal civil rights precedent, creating the kind of integrated community scene that Rebecca had tried to destroy. Carmen delivered the legal victory speech that made civil rights law students across the country cheer. Federal prosecutors announced that investigation had revealed a multi-state discrimination network targeting minority homeowners in at least 7 cities. RICO charges are pending against the entire criminal enterprise, she announced with visible satisfaction. All properties acquired through racially discriminatory schemes are subject to federal asset forfeiture, with proceeds going into a civil rights restitution fund, specifically for families affected by housing discrimination. But the moment that made highlight reels nationwide came when a reporter asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mr. Washington, do you have any advice for HOA boards watching this case?" I paused, looked directly into the camera, and smiled the smile of someone who'd spent 25 years learning the rules inside and out while living as a black man in America. "Yes," I said. "Read the municipal codes and the civil rights laws before you try to break them. And remember, some of us wrote those codes, lived through segregation, and know exactly what racial discrimination looks like, even when it's disguised as community standards." The follow-up question gave me the perfect setup for the message that would resonate with minority families nationwide. "Any other advice for boards dealing with diverse neighborhoods?" "The law isn't complicated," I said, thinking about my grandfather farming this land when black families couldn't live wherever they could afford. "Respect your neighbors' rights regardless of their race, follow proper procedures without discriminatory targeting, and focus on genuine community improvement instead of demographic control. It's that simple. And if you can't handle living next to successful black families, maybe you need to examine your own character instead of trying to drive us away." Jake's live broadcast that evening featured our family in what he called the most important civil rights interview of the year. Keisha's message resonated with parents nationwide, but especially with minority families who'd faced similar targeting. Our children learned that standing up for civil rights isn't easy, but it's always necessary. They learned that racism doesn't disappear just because we succeed. Sometimes it gets more sophisticated. But they also learned that the law can protect us when we document everything and refuse to be intimidated. The symbolic moment came when we returned to our property that evening. I planted a new oak tree where our house had once stood, for strength, longevity, and roots that go deeper than hatred, I explained to the cameras, still following our story. Community members brought soil from their own gardens, turning the tree planting into a reconciliation ceremony that acknowledged both the racial divisions Rebecca had exploited and the integrated community we were building together. Malik and Zara helped water the sapling, while neighbors who'd remained silent during the harassment finally found their voices to apologize and commit to actively opposing discrimination. The rich earth smell mixed with cool water soaking into soil, and a gentle breeze rustled through leaves that would grow tall long After the last traces of Rebecca's racist terrorism had been forgotten, national media picked up our story as a symbol of both ongoing housing discrimination and the power of federal civil rights law to protect minority families. CNN ran "The Racist HOA Plot, One Family's Civil Rights Victory." Fox News featured "When Community Standards Become Racial Targeting." NBC produced "The Code Enforcer Who Enforced Justice, a Civil Rights Story." Social media exploded with our stories shared over 800,000 times, spawning hashtags like housing rights, our civil rights, and Jerome's fight that would influence federal civil rights enforcement and housing discrimination legislation in 15 states. Judge Morrison's sentencing statement became civil rights legal precedent that would be cited for decades. This case represents systematic abuse of community authority for racially discriminatory purposes, disguised as legitimate property management. The defendant's actions violated not only local property laws, but fundamental constitutional rights to equal housing opportunity. Rebecca received 12 years federal prison with hate crime enhancements and $4.7 million in civil rights restitution. Webb got 6 years federal prison, lifetime ban from public office, and forfeiture of all properties acquired through discriminatory schemes. The shell companies were dissolved under RICO statutes, with all assets distributed to minority families who'd been targeted. That evening, we celebrated not in vindictive triumph, but in quiet satisfaction that civil rights law still worked when properly enforced. The victory celebration in Community Park drew 250 residents, including former Rebecca supporters, who'd finally understood the difference between legitimate community standards and racial discrimination. "We're not celebrating someone's downfall," I told the crowd, with civil rights attorneys and federal investigators nodding approval. "We're celebrating the fact that federal civil rights law still protects minority families when local systems fail us. We're celebrating the fact that my grandfather's dream of black homeownership can't be destroyed by sophisticated racism disguised as community standards." 6 months later, the sound of hammers echoing across our property had replaced the sinister silence of that terrible week when racial terrorism nearly destroyed our family. Our new home rose from the ashes, literally incorporating the best of our old craftsman design with modern upgrades and security features that would make any code enforcer proud. Federal civil rights settlement totaled $685,000, $340,000 for property reconstruction, $145,000 for contents and emotional distress, $200,000 in civil rights damages that acknowledged the racial targeting our family endured. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, an advanced security system protected every corner, and my expanded workshop buzzed with projects again, including furniture pieces for other families who'd faced housing discrimination. The smell of fresh lumber mixed with morning coffee as Keisha and I planned our future from the same wraparound porch, rebuilt exactly where it belonged, with a new addition that would serve as a community meeting space for civil rights education. The community transformation was even more satisfying than our personal recovery and established a model for addressing housing discrimination through community engagement. HOA members had voted unanimously to dissolve their organization entirely, replacing it with a voluntary neighborhood association focused on genuine improvement and explicitly committed to opposing discrimination in all forms. Keisha was elected as coordinator. They called her community builder instead of president, and 31 of 34 families actively participated in activities that brought people together across racial lines: integrated block parties, diverse garden tours, civil rights education workshops, and community service projects that replaced violation inspections with mutual support. My professional recognition turned into opportunities I'd never imagined, but with a focus on civil rights enforcement that would protect other minority families. Promotion to Regional Director of Code Enforcement and Civil Rights Compliance came with speaking engagements at municipal conferences across 5 states. My training program, Ethical Enforcement and Civil Rights Protection, was adopted by 63 cities seeking to prevent the kind of discrimination we'd exposed. Keisha established the Malik and Zara Washington Civil Rights Education Foundation, using a portion of our legal settlement plus contributions from civil rights organizations and community donations. The scholarship fund supported students who demonstrated commitment to civil rights activism. kids willing to stand up against discrimination even when it wasn't popular or safe. Our first 5 recipients were planning careers in civil rights law, investigative journalism, focusing on housing discrimination, and public service with emphasis on protecting minority families from systematic targeting. The legal legacy extended far beyond our neighborhood and established federal precedent that would protect minority homeowners for generations. Washington versus Sterling was cited in 41 subsequent civil rights cases involving housing discrimination across the country. Federal legislation called the Housing Rights Protection Act included our case as primary evidence in congressional testimony about ongoing segregation in American suburbs. 7 states passed enhanced penalties for racially motivated HOA harassment with mandatory federal reporting requirements based on our evidence. The Department of Housing and Urban Development established new enforcement protocols for investigating discrimination disguised as community standards. Jake's Pulitzer Prize for the series The New Segregation: How Racism Became a Real Estate Business Model brought national attention to housing discrimination that most Americans thought had ended with the civil rights era. Netflix produced The HOA Conspiracy, a Civil Rights Story, with Keisha and me as executive producers, reaching millions of viewers who'd never considered how modern racism operates through property law and community organizations. Keisha wrote Standing Our Ground, A Family's Fight Against Housing Discrimination, which became required reading in law school civil rights courses and high school American history classes, studying ongoing struggles for racial equality. Our speaking circuit expanded nationwide, sharing our story at conferences where we met dozens of minority families fighting similar battles. The annual Housing Rights and Community Justice Festival in our community park became a regional attraction, drawing over 400 residents from surrounding areas, all gathering around the oak tree, now 4 feet tall, that served as our memorial to the fight for integrated neighborhoods. Malik chose journalism with a focus on investigating housing discrimination, following Mr. Jake's example while bringing his own perspective as a young black man who'd witnessed federal civil rights law in action. Zara set her sights on civil rights law, determined to protect families who faced what we'd endured, but might not have our resources or knowledge. Keisha's election to the school board created opportunities to advocate for civil rights education curriculum that would teach kids about ongoing discrimination and their rights before they needed to fight for them. Her programs were adopted by school districts in 12 states as models for addressing racism and promoting integration. Most importantly, our example sparked national conversation about housing discrimination in the 21st century and the need for continued civil rights enforcement. 52 states introduced HOA reform legislation, citing our case. Congressional hearings on housing discrimination included Keisha's testimony about the psychological impact of racial targeting on minority families. The Washington model became studied by urban planning programs as proof that communities could maintain standards through integration and cooperation rather than exclusion and discrimination. Our chickens returned too, naturally. Heritage breed birds named Justice, Liberty, Freedom, Hope, and Equality provided fresh eggs and endless entertainment for visiting grandchildren whose presence proved that integration was not only possible but beautiful. Their contented clucking mixed with children's giggles, speaking multiple languages, and morning sun warming the new coo that Keisha had designed with artistic flair and community input. But the most satisfying moment came last week when my phone rang with a familiar request, but now with federal civil rights implications. Mr. Washington, my name is Maria Gonzalez. I'm in Phoenix, and my HOA is trying to force me to remove my vegetable garden. I found your story online, and I think they're targeting my family because we're Latino. Can you help? Keisha laughed when I started packing the car, along with civil rights case files and contact information for federal investigators. Here we go again, she said with pride. Road trip to Arizona, I confirmed, loading my trusty municipal code books, evidence collection kit, and federal civil rights manual, because apparently we're in the civil rights enforcement business now. The fight for housing equality never really ends. It just moves to the next community that needs help understanding that integrated neighborhoods make America stronger. And Keisha and I wouldn't have it any other way. Have you or someone you know faced housing discrimination, disguised as HOA harassment? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else know they're not alone. and that federal civil rights law can protect them. If this story inspired you to stand up for civil rights in your community, hit that subscribe button. Every week, we share real stories of ordinary people who refuse to be intimidated by discrimination and who use the law to protect not just themselves, but future families who deserve to live anywhere they can afford. Because sometimes David really does beat Goliath, especially when David knows both property law and civil rights law. You've been watching Civil Rights Stories, where discrimination disguised as community standards gets the federal response it deserves. If this episode gave you hope that justice still works when properly applied, hit that like, share your own experiences in the comments, and subscribe so you're the first in line for more stories about families who fought discrimination and won. Remember, housing rights are civil rights, and civil rights are worth fighting for.